Imagine standing on a quiet Boston street on a cold January afternoon. Children are playing, workers are walking home for lunch, and horses pull wagons down the narrow lanes. Suddenly, without warning, the ground begins to shake. A low rumble grows louder and louder until it sounds like thunder exploding in your ears. Then it comes the wave. But it is not water. It is not fire. It is something far stranger. A wall of thick, dark molasses, taller than a building, rushing forward at 35 miles per hour. Within seconds, houses are crushed, streets are drowned, and lives are swept away in sticky, suffocating chaos. This is not fiction. This really happened. The year was 1919. The city was Boston, and the disaster became known as the Great Molasses Flood. Welcome to HEH TV, where we uncover the strange, shocking, and forgotten stories from history that textbooks often skip. Today, we dive deep into one of the most bizarre disasters America has ever seen. A tragedy so strange, people at first thought it was a joke. But for the victims, there was nothing funny about it. This is the true story of the Great Molasses Flood. Boston in 1919 was a city in transition. The First World War had just ended. Soldiers were coming home, industries were booming, and prohibition, the nationwide ban on alcohol, was about to begin. In this strange moment in history, molasses was not just a sweetener. It was big business. Molasses was imported by the millions of gallons from the Caribbean. It was used to make rum, candy, and even ammunition. In fact, molasses could be fermented into industrial alcohol, a key ingredient for weapons production during the war. The Purity Distilling Company, owned by the powerful United States Industrial Alcohol Company, saw an opportunity. They built a giant storage tank in the north end of Boston, right near the harbor. This tank was enormous, 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, and capable of holding more than 2 million gallons of molasses. To put that into perspective, that's enough to fill 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The tank towered over the neighborhood, a dark steel giant that loomed above the working-class homes and crowded streets below. But there was a problem. From the very beginning, the tank was flawed. The tank was built quickly, in 1915, to meet wartime demand, but corners were cut. It was constructed using steel that was too thin. Rivets were poorly installed. No proper safety tests were carried out. In fact, legend has it that the company simply filled the tank with water once to check for leaks, and when it began to drip, they just painted it brown so the leaks would be harder to see. Residents of the neighborhood complained for years that molasses leaked from the seams of the tank. Children would scoop it up in cups and take it home. Neighbors joked that the tank groaned like a restless monster, but the company ignored the warnings. To them, the tank was a moneymaker, not a safety hazard. By January 1919, the tank was nearly full, containing over 2.3 million gallons of molasses. The winter had been cold, but on January 15th, the temperature rose rapidly, reaching around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Some scientists believe that the sudden shift in temperature caused the molasses to expand inside the tank, putting enormous pressure on the already weak steel walls. At 12:40 p.m. on January 15, 1919, the tank could no longer hold. With a sound like gunfire, the rivets shot out of the steel walls. Then, in a deafening roar, the tank burst open. What followed was pure chaos. A tidal wave of molasses, 25 feet high at its peak, surged through the north end, moving at 35 miles per hour it destroyed everything in its path. Wooden houses were ripped from their foundations. Horses pulling wagons were swallowed whole. A railroad freight car, weighing tons, was lifted off the tracks like a toy. People described the wave as a dark brown tsunami. The sticky flood swept across 2 million square feet of the city, filling basements, climbing walls, and trapping anyone who could not escape in time. Some victims were literally picked up and hurled through the air by the force of the wave. Others suffocated as the thick syrup filled their lungs. One firefighter was crushed when his firehouse collapsed under the force of the molasses. Children playing in the street never had a chance. In total, 21 people were killed and around 150 were injured. Behind these numbers were real lives. 8-year-old Pasquale Ann Tosca was playing outside when the wave struck. He was swept away before his mother could even reach the door. Another young boy, John Callahan, was crushed beneath the collapsing freight cars. Many adults also perished. Maria Di Stasio, 65, was walking home when she was engulfed. Workers in a nearby city stable drowned as horses panicked and kicked against their stalls. For some victims, the struggle lasted hours as rescuers fought to free them from the sticky trap. One survivor later recalled, "Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage." Here and there struggled a form, whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Rescue efforts began immediately, but they were incredibly difficult. Police, firefighters, and volunteers rushed to the scene, but every step was a fight. The molasses was knee-deep, and it clung to boots, tools, and bodies. Rescuers had to wade through the sticky mess, cutting through debris to reach the trapped. Horses screamed in pain as they were pulled under. Survivors cried out for help, but many could not be saved in time. The Boston harbor itself turned brown from the molasses, and for weeks afterward, the smell lingered in the air. Cleanup took months. Crews used salt water from fireboats and sand to try to wash the streets. Even so, Boston residents claimed that the smell of molasses haunted the city for decades. The flood shocked the nation. Newspapers around the world reported on the bizarre tragedy. But soon, questions turned to blame. How could such a disaster happen? Who was responsible for building such a dangerous tank in the middle of a crowded neighborhood? A massive court case followed, one of the longest in Massachusetts history at the time. Over 100 lawsuits were filed against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Witnesses testified about the leaking tank, the groaning steel, and the company's failure to test the structure properly. The company tried to argue that anarchists had blown up the tank, a fear that was common at the time, since political unrest was high in 1919. But no evidence supported this theory. The truth was simple: corporate negligence. The company had cut costs, ignored warnings, and put profits above safety. In the end, the court ruled that the company was at fault. They paid out millions of dollars in damages, equivalent to tens of millions today. The Great Molasses Flood left scars that went beyond the physical damage. Families lost loved ones. Survivors carried trauma for the rest of their lives. But the disaster also led to change. For the first time, the courts held a corporation accountable for industrial negligence in such a massive way. Building regulations in Boston became stricter. Companies were no longer allowed to construct massive tanks without proper safety checks. And yet, despite its significance, the story faded from popular memory. Today, most Americans have never heard of the Great Molasses Flood, It sounds almost too strange to be true, which is perhaps why it was forgotten. The Great Molasses Flood is more than a bizarre piece of trivia. It is a warning. A reminder that negligence, greed, and the failure to respect safety standards can have deadly consequences. Whether it is a skyscraper, a dam, or a chemical plant, the lessons of 1919 still matter today. Imagine being trapped, not by fire or water, but by a flood of syrup. Imagine fighting for breath as molasses pulls you under. For the people of Boston's North End, this was no nightmare. It was reality. The smell of molasses may have faded from Boston streets, but the lesson should never fade from history. This was the true story of the Great Molasses Flood of 1919, an American tragedy that textbooks often skip, but one we should never forget.